Welcome to Checking Your Pay, a beginner's guide to navigating your flight summary. My name is Jesse Matthews. I am one of 8 vice presidents at Local 4094 in Vancouver. Just a disclaimer before we get started, this presentation has been provided to you on behalf of the Education Committee at the Vancouver Local. This is meant as a guide and without any prejudice or precedent. If there is discrepancy between this presentation and what is contained in the collective agreement or any applicable legislation such as arbitrations or mediation or any other policies, then in that case the collective agreement and any of that legislation or policies will take precedence over this presentation. And without any further ado, let us get started. So let us start out by talking about the two pay documents that we use. The first one that we use is a pay statement. This is issued to employees in all departments, not just in flight services. But the second document, and the one that we're going to look at in more depth in this presentation, is the flight summary. This is specific to in-flight services. This provides a breakdown of the various activities, mostly flying activities, that determine how you are paid for any particular month. To best understand this document, we're going to walk through the different sections of it so that you can become very familiar with reading it and decoding it when you are checking your own pay. So let's get started. This right here indicates my status as far as the classification that I am in for this month. For this month, I am classified as a flight attendant. This indicates where I am based as a flight attendant, as does this. This specifies the particular month that I am in for the purposes of pay. The first major section of our flight summary is what is known as flight information. You can think of this section as the section that logs your activity for the month. Not necessarily how you're paid for that activity, just the activity itself. The first major column that we have is INDX, that is short for index. Every bit of activity that we have corresponding to our month, it corresponds to a line entry, and each of these entries is coded with an index number. That helps us for the purpose of being paid for what we do in the month. So this is index number 1, for example, and then so on and so forth. It increases by 1 as you go down in the flight information section. In the larger column specified as actual departure and arrival times are recorded for any particular flight or activity. In the first subcolumn, we have departure, and in the second, we have arrival. This should be fairly self-explanatory. And then beneath both of those, we have date and time corresponding to each departure and arrival. Note that the date and the time for departure and for arrival correspond to the specific time zone for the airport of departure and for the airport of arrival. In this case, we have 12:19 a.m. for the departure time for this activity, and that corresponds to the airport in question, which was YVR. So 12:19 a.m. local time, that is Pacific time, that is when the flight departed from Vancouver. 8:01 a.m., that was the actual arrival time for this activity, and that was in YYZ. So 8:01 a.m. local time in Toronto, that is Eastern time, that is when the flight actually arrived. FLT NBR, that is short for flight number. So this flight number was flight 182, going from Vancouver to Toronto. FLT MINS, that is short for flight minutes. That is the scheduled number of flight minutes for this particular activity. So it was 282 scheduled flight minutes. EQP, that represents equipment. So that is the aircraft type for the activity. And in this case, it was the Boeing 767 for the aircraft type. EMPSTAT, that stands for employee status, so my status as an employee at the time of this activity, and that is a flight attendant. This corresponds to the expectation for me in general for this month, and that is that I am a flight attendant. SVC-CD, that represents service code. This code indicates where on the pay progression scale that I am at for this particular activity. So here I am at step 1 of the flight attendant scale. So right at the beginning of my career, basically. DESC, that is short for description. This is additional information that needs to be captured in the flight summary to help us with some sort of differentiation for the purpose of pay. On this line, description indicates 100 hours. And in this case, it's because I'm on reserve that this is important. 100 hours or VE is paid over and above our minimum monthly guarantee when we're on reserve, so it has to be noted when we've done any sort of flying that is 100 hours, and that way it can be appropriately factored into calculating our pay. You'll see there's other descriptors like DPG, that is our duty period guarantee, deadhead, in which case we're only paid for half of the flying minutes, standby reserve, so that indicates that we are doing a standby and not a flight, and so on and so forth. There are multiple descriptors that can be used to help us for the purpose of calculating pay. The last major column in flight information is pay minutes. The best thing to do in this section is to look under total, as that is what we are paid for at the end of the day. So in this case, 282 minutes is what I was paid for that activity. And then if we go all the way to the bottom, we can see the total pay minutes for all of the activity registered in flight information. So you may have noticed that everything here is written in minutes. Hours have not been used at all. When we look at Globe, we see hours, such as in this month, I had 58 hours and 35 minutes of flying activity. But what do we see in our flight information section? We see minutes. And indeed, pay is calculated using minutes and not hours. That means that we have to convert back and forth between hours and minutes format to just minutes format and vice versa. In order to do this, we multiply the number of hours by 60 and then add the minutes afterwards. So for example, with 58 hours and 35 minutes, we take the 58 and then multiply that by 60, and that gets us 3,480 minutes. After that, we simply add the 35 minutes that we saw with the 58 hours. And then once we do that, we get a grand total of 3,515 minutes to be paid. That does correspond with the total number of minutes that we saw at the very bottom of the total pay minutes column. So that is correct as far as how much we are expecting to be paid. If you want to do the math backwards, as far as converting from minutes to hours and minutes format, we can take those same 3,515 minutes and we can divide that by 60. That gets us 58 hours, but then we have a fraction after that. And of course, we don't tell time using decimals, we tell time using minutes. So what we then do is remove the 58 ever so briefly, so that all we are looking at is the fraction. We then multiply the fraction by 60 to get the number of minutes that it represents. And in this case, that number is 35. That gets us the 58 hours that we crossed out. We add 35 minutes after, and that gets us 58 hours and 35 minutes, which again matches to what we see in Globe. So we've talked about the flight information section. We're going to now talk about the flight duty credits section. I mentioned earlier that flight information is related to your flying activity. It's essentially your schedule, whereas flight duty credits show what you are paid for that schedule and all of that activity. The main connection between the flight information section and the flight duty credit section is the index number. So INDX in flight duty credits, that has the same function as INDX over in flight information. It is the index number that links these two sections. Let's talk about the columns in the flight duty credit section and how those are relevant to you when checking your pay. We have the pay stat column. This is similar to the emp stat column from flight information. In this case, the pay stat column, that stands for pay status. So for the purposes of pay, what was my status for the activity in question? Sometimes your pay status is not the same as your employee status. That's a little bit beyond the scope of this particular video. So we'll just say, because it is true, that for the most part, emp stat and pay stat will match. So in this case, FA, that matches my status as an employee at the time, which was flight attendant. Pay SVC, that would be the service code for the purpose of pay, and that usually is going to be the same as SVC CD from flight information. So I was at step 1 on the flight attendant pay scale, so that dictates a specific pay rate. Basic, that is a column that talks about the basic elements of how we are paid, excluding any sort of premiums. The first subsection within basic is pay min, that's pay minutes. This number is always going to be identical to the total pay minutes as found in the flight information table. So 282 minutes for this particular index item is identical to the total pay minutes found for index item 1 in the flight information table. Those 282 minutes are paid at my pay rate at the time, which was 0.43567 per minute. And when you take 282 minutes and multiply it by 0.43567, you get a total amount of $122.86 as shown in the amount column. Minimum monthly guarantee on reserve. By default, on reserve, regardless of your flying activity, you are paid for 75 hours. As we mentioned, everything related to pay is calculated in minutes, so 75 hours in minutes is 4,500. That's the magical number we're looking for at minimum in terms of our pay. If for some reason we are not available for a portion of the flying month, then our minimum monthly guarantee is reduced to reflect that time off of payroll. The reduction is 2 hours and 25 minutes, which in minutes only format is 145 minutes. And 145 minutes is multiplied by the number of days off of payroll, and that tells us the new minimum monthly guarantee that we need. So in this case, in May of 2017, I was only on payroll for 12 days, and that started on May the 20th this month. There were 31 total days in May that I was expected to be available. So 19 days had to be removed from my minimum monthly guarantee, and that was the basis for which I was paid for the remainder of the month. So 145 minutes, as we mentioned before, had to be multiplied by 19 to determine how much was reduced from the standard minimum monthly guarantee. So when multiplying 145 by 19, we get a total of 2,755 minutes. That number is not explicitly shown when you look at your flight summary, but you can always do the math on your own as long as you see how many days that you are shown as on payroll. So in this case, if I take 4,500 and subtract 2,755, I get a total of 1,745, and that is the amount of time that my flight summary is showing for the purposes of pay. So that is the correct number to work from. I need to make sure I am paid for 1,745 minutes for the 12 days that I am available in this month. So what did I actually do in this month? If we look under flight information, I'm showing 3 activities. These are marked by 3 index numbers. With index item number 1, I had a flight from Vancouver to Toronto, and there were 260 minutes of pay involved with that. With index item number 2, I had 90 minutes of DPG. And with index item number 3, I had 152 minutes corresponding to a deadhead from Toronto to Vancouver. All of those added up are a total of 502 minutes. Now, even without doing the math, 502 is clearly not the 1,745 minutes that I have to be paid for this month. So the simple math to do is to take 1,745, subtract the 502 minutes from it, And that gets us a total of 1,243 minutes that I need to get topped up with in order to get paid what I am due as my minimum guarantee. Those same 1,243 minutes are then multiplied by my applicable hourly rate, which is 0.43567, and that creates a total of $541.54. You recall that 502 minutes correspond to what I do in May of this month. And to get paid for those minutes, we see with index 1 that the 260 minutes were multiplied by my hourly rate. The 90 minutes were multiplied by my hourly rate. And the 152 minutes were multiplied by my hourly rate. All those numbers were added up and got me to $218.70. That number is then carried down to the minimum monthly guarantee. Both of those are added together, and we get our total pay relating to these 12 days on duty of $760.24. Ground duty credits and per diems. Ground duty credits are paid at 1/2 of our hourly rate. When we look at our flight summary, there is a column in the ground duty credit section called factor. And when there is a factor of 50 applied to the line, that means that we're paid at 50% of our standard rate per minute. So in this case, my rate per minute as a flight attendant, as we saw before, was 0.43567. But here there is a factor of 50 applied, so it's really 50% of that rate per minute is what I am paid for any ground activity. In this particular case, there was what is known as pre-post credit. That's the amount of extra minutes that we show up early for wide body flights at home base, and we are paid a modest amount for that extra time that we show up. Meal allowances, otherwise known as per diems, are calculated using Article 7.02 in the collective agreement. In each block month that we have, there's a new PDF with meal allowances that is uploaded to Aeronet. And this is applicable for all locations that we fly to. This is an example of a meal allowance chart that we used. And this helps us figure out what the breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snack is for any given destination or country that we fly into. The Mystery of Meals is a supplemental document that was issued in 2008 by our union for the purpose of clarifying some of the otherwise vague or unclear language regarding how to determine our per diems. This document is based on past memoranda of agreement between the union and the company. Having said that, the standard disclaimer applies for this document in that the collective agreement ultimately supersedes it if there were to be any discrepancy. Having said that, this document has been around for a long time. and has not changed since 2008. So it is fairly reliable as far as using it to determine eligibility for any given meal allowance. We are often asked if a destination counts as domestic or if it counts as overseas with respect to contractual definition. Appendix 1 in our collective agreement has a map, and this particular map has a boundary line that is drawn around most of North America. Anything within the boundary line is considered domestic as a destination, and anything outside of the boundary line is considered overseas. Now, the reason that this is relevant is because crew rest is different depending on whether you have flights to and from a domestic classified destination or an overseas classified destination. In addition, when a flight destination is classified as overseas, there are meals that are supposed to be boarded on those flights, and those meals are provided to you instead of per diems. So it's important to know which flights are overseas for that purpose. There is a list of what are known as southern destinations and Hawaii. The document is titled Legal Rest Periods, Southern Destinations on Hawaii. It can be found on Aeronet. This document contains the vast majority of the southern destinations and Hawaiian destinations that we fly to. Having said that, there are occasionally exceptions, so it's worth pointing out this list is not exhaustive. Let's give two examples so that we can apply our knowledge using the chart. In this particular duty day, we have Vancouver to Toronto, and of course, right back from Toronto to Vancouver. The duty day starts in Vancouver. It goes all the way into Toronto, and then comes all the way back to Vancouver. You can see that the flight path remains inside of the boundary line the entire time. So this would be classified as a domestic pairing. That means that meal allowances would be paid for the time on duty, and crew rest would be considered based on domestic crew rest rules, not overseas. Let's take this particular duty day where Vancouver to Kona happens in duty day number 1, and then Kona back to Vancouver in duty day number 2. So we start in Vancouver and then fly to Kona, and after having rest in Kona, coming back to Vancouver. Kona is quite clearly outside of the boundary line drawn on the map, so accordingly, this would be classified as an overseas pairing. That means that meals are expected to be boarded, and therefore meal allowances would not be paid for the time in the air going to Kona or coming from Kona. And for crew rest purposes, it would be overseas crew rest required at home base. And then similarly, minimum crew rest for overseas would apply in Kona as well. Let's look at a couple more. We have Vancouver to London on day 1, and then London back to Vancouver on the final day. It's going from Vancouver after laying over in London, coming back to Vancouver. London is quite clearly outside of the boundary line, so London would be an overseas classified pairing here, and that means that crew rest at home base would be based on overseas classification for the pairing, and also minimum crew rest in London would apply as well. And no meal allowances would be paid for the time while on board to and from London. And that's because of the boarded meals again. Only one more example. We have Vancouver to Santa Ana, and right back from Santa Ana to Vancouver. That would be shown on the map like this. And coming right back. This is pretty clearly inside of the boundary lines, so this would be a domestic classified pairing for the purposes of meal allowances and for crew rest. So when calculating meal allowances, we use the mystery of meals to help us figure out which, if any, we are entitled to. The easiest way to think about your eligibility is to think about the first and the last meal that you were entitled to. The first that you were entitled to, you can determine by using departures. And in the departures area, you're really thinking about when you're starting your duty period at home base. To figure out your last meal allowance in a pairing, that would be when you were arriving back at home base. And if you were operating that flight, then your duty day ends 15 minutes after arriving back at home base. If you're deadheading, it ends immediately at arrival time. If we look at the timings that are described in the mystery of meals as it relates to this duty day, we can very quickly determine what we are and are not eligible for. Our departure time from Vancouver to Santa Ana was 8:29 a.m. Our check-in time was 7:35 a.m. When we're looking at the first meal we're eligible for, breakfast, we want to see if we're eligible for that. Did we depart before 8 a.m.? No, we did not, because 8:29 a.m. was the actual departure time from home base. So we are not eligible for breakfast. To get a lunch per diem, we have to depart before 12:30 p.m. 8:29 is before 12:30. And then we have to be on duty from 12:30 to 1:30 p.m. Those are both true. So lunch is the first per diem we are entitled to. We then want to determine the last that we are entitled to. We know that we weren't eligible for breakfast, as we saw earlier, so there's no need to check that here. We do know that we were eligible for lunch based on checking earlier, so we'll check that here again to save time. Let's now look at the dinner per diem criteria in the arrivals section. To get a dinner per diem, we have to arrive after 6:30 p.m. and be on duty from 5 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. The flight back to Vancouver arrived at 3:35 p.m. So we know immediately that we are not eligible for dinner because that's not after 6:30 p.m. So that would be X here, and of course, not eligible for snack either. So all in all, we are eligible for a lunch per diem for this particular pairing. The second question that we have to ask ourselves is whether this lunch per diem is paid at the Canadian rate or if it is paid at the United States rate for that lunch. So we have two sets of criteria. And the second has a decision tree here where it asks us if the flight departs before noon or if it departs at noon or later. If we look at flight 598, the flight departed at 8:29 a.m., which is prior to noon. That indicates that the lunch should be paid at the rate of the country of destination. Santa Ana is in the United States, so that would be the United States rate. We can also look at this the other way around. If we look at flight 599, that's going back to Vancouver from Santa Ana. The flight departed at 12:41 p.m. And since the flight departed at 12 or later, the lunch is paid at the country of departure when looking at this flight. And the country of departure was the United States for this flight leaving at 12:41. So country of departure, when looking at it from this angle, is still the United States. So in this case, we would expect, based on the meal allowances chart, that we would get a total of $24.02 for our lunch per diem for this pairing. Overseas per diems operate in a slightly different set of logic. As we mentioned before, there are meals that are boarded instead of meal allowances paid while in flight to and from an overseas destination. There are also different sets of timing that are used to figure out which meal allowances were paid while we are at our overseas destination. So let's use this particular pairing that involves going to and from London Heathrow. If we have a look at our pairing here, Flight 860 arrived in London at 10:50 a.m. In the Mystery of Meals, we figure out which meal allowances we're entitled to on the day of arrival at an overseas destination based on the scheduled arrival time at layover. There are three options. The first is for any arrival before 12:30 p.m. The second is for an arrival between 12:30 and 1:30 p.m. And the third is for an arrival after 1:30 p.m. In this case, we arrived at 10:50 a.m. So pretty clearly it's going to be option 1, which is breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snack. That'll be payable for November the 6th in this case, as the flight departing on November the 5th from Vancouver arrived in London on November the 6th. Now, November the 7th, that was the date of Flight 861 leaving London, going back to Vancouver. The flight departed London at 2:28 p.m. local time. And to figure out the meal allowances we are entitled to on the day of departure, we look at this section of the Mystery of Meals, where there are 4 choices given to us. And the choices differentiate between departures from 7 a.m. to 11:29 a.m. 11:30 a.m. to 4:59 p.m., 5 p.m. to 9:59 p.m., and 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. In this case, the flight departed at 2:28 p.m., so the choice for us on the day of departure is breakfast and lunch. Note that these per diems are paid at the rate of the layover destination, which for us is London Heathrow. So it would be all of the values corresponding to this section of the meal allowances chart. For any layover at an overseas destination that involves more than one calendar day, that is to say there's a full calendar day where you are not arriving or departing from that station, you are entitled to all 4 of the meals at the layover destination's rate. So that would be breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snack. Now, since we don't get per diems while flying to and from an overseas destination, there is some logic as far as what meals are to be boarded for you in lieu of getting those meal allowances. So for a flight to and from London, we can see that the flight time credit was 9 hours 20 minutes going to London and 9 hours 26 minutes coming from London. That corresponds to this particular section of the Mystery of Meals, which indicates that we should be expecting 1 hot meal, 1 snack, and 1 piece of fruit to be boarded for us on each of those flight legs. So we're going to move on to working through eClaims whenever we find mistakes related to our pay. We're going to look at my flight summary, or at least a portion of it, from October 2021. When looking at my flight summary, we can see that there are 2 activities in the flight information section. Index 1 indicates that I flew from Vancouver to Toronto, and Index 2 indicates that I flew from Toronto back to Vancouver. My flight departure time from Vancouver was 9:20 a.m. My flight arrival time back in Vancouver from Toronto was 8:05 p.m. When we use the logic discussed earlier as far as determining our first and last meal allowance, we know that we would not be eligible for a breakfast because the flight from Vancouver to Toronto left at 9:20 a.m. We do know that we would be entitled to a lunch since we were on duty and departed before 12:30. And we also know that we'd be eligible for a dinner back at home base because we arrived at 8:05 p.m., which is after 6:30 p.m. local time in Vancouver. We know that we would not be eligible for a snack because our duty day finished before 11 p.m. Crew cycle expenses is the section of the flight summary where we look for our meal allowances. Meal entitlement is the major column where we see breakfast, lunch, dinner, snack, and night dinners paid out, or at least where they should be paid out. We mentioned that lunch and dinner should be paid for this particular flight pairing. What we see is that there is a dinner paid That's good. But there was no lunch paid. That's not good. So we had just $37.95 paid. Based on October 2021, which would correspond to the allowances in effect as of April 1st, 2021, I am missing $19.16 that I need to be paid for a lunch during this pairing. So eClaims can be accessed by logging into AeroNet, going to in-flight service, crew scheduling and planning, and then expense claims. You'd click on the Access eClaim link and then log in using your employee ID and your password. eClaims has two major sections. The first is Submit Claim. This is fairly straightforward. This is where you would go to submit any sort of claim involving pay, where you are looking to recover that missing pay. Check status of claims. That would be where you see what is happening with any claim that you have made and take any further action from there. Within Submit Claim, there are 5 categories of eClaims that you can make. The first is Pay Adjustment. This is used whenever you find a mistake of some sort with your flight attendant or service director pay. This would be missing minutes, for example. Perhaps you're paid at the wrong rate of pay. There's multiple reasons that you would use this particular section to make a pay claim. Next is the ground duty claim section. This is usually just completed by service directors. The only time a flight attendant would file for ground duty would be if they had been moved up to the service director position. Otherwise, only service directors are able to file for ground duty. Meals not boarded is not used very often anymore. This would be when you are either operating or deadheading on an overseas pairing and don't have a meal boarded for you. You would need to fill out an eClaim along with some other steps to get paid in lieu of the boarded meal that you should have had. Crew cycle expenses will be the eClaim type that you use when you are eClaiming for missing per diems that should have been paid for a pairing. And then finally, the last eClaim type is passport. This is to claim for the $177 corresponding to the 10-year passport that we need for completing any of our work-related duties. So we're going to go into crew cycle expenses, as this is most often what you'll be dealing with when you are missing per diems as a flight attendant or service director. This is just a quick look at the different fields to be completed to recover your meal allowances. The red stars indicate any of the fields that are required to be completed, and you'll notice that there are several, such as pairing number and pairing date, and comments that are not required. I'd still recommend completing them when you know the information, as this assists crew pay with determining the validity of your claim. So when you have the information, I would recommend providing it. Most of the fields to be completed are fairly self-explanatory. All the same, I will walk through them one by one. The pairing number for the pairing in question, where we are filing for the missing lunch per diem, is V7063. You can see that by looking in Globe at your schedule and matching it to what you observed in your flight summary. Next is pairing date. you can click on the calculator, and that will open up a calendar where you can select the date for the pairing in question. And in this case, the pairing itself was on October the 2nd in 2021. Flight number you can find looking at Globe. In this case, flight 108 corresponds to the time that I should have gotten the lunch per diem. Flight date is October the 2nd as well. You can find that looking in Globe as well. Departure and arrival airports are fairly self-explanatory. You can find both of those looking in Globe at the corresponding flight information. Meal type, we want to pick the one that relates to the meal that is missing. For us, that was lunch. So we would, of course, select lunch in the drop-down menu. We want to select the appropriate reason for our eClaim. There's really only two that we will ever use when we are eClaiming, and that would be the first two items, indicating that either the expense amount was incorrectly calculated or it was missing altogether. And in our case, it was missing. So this would be the option to select in the menu for this particular eClaim. The amount entitled, based on the rates in effect as of April the 1st, 2021. The amount entitled for lunch is $19.16. So that is the amount to put into the amount entitled field. And then over in amount paid, we indicate how much was actually given to us. We can see in the crew cycle expenses table that there was nothing given to us whatsoever. So the amount paid would also be 0. And finally, in additional comments, we usually like to specify, whenever possible, what it is that we are looking for in our claim. So in this case, I'm usually just fairly straight to the point, and I have put lunch per diem not paid for pairing. Finally, once that's all done, if you hit continue, then you will be given the option to submit the claim, or you can hit previous if you want to correct something. You'll notice that there is an amount claimed section. Basically, the amount claimed takes the amount you were entitled to and subtracts the amount that you were paid from the entitled amount and gives you a final number. Since we were paid nothing, $19.16 minus 0 is $19.16 being claimed. Once you've confirmed by hitting submit, you will see a reference number corresponding to the claim that you've made. The status of the claim always starts out as submitted, and then you are given a date and time that your eClaim was submitted officially. In the submitted claim section, that would be the second of the two options from when you first log into eClaims. You can see a list of any eClaims that either you or someone else on your behalf have made. You can see that there are reference numbers for any eClaim that's made. The type of eClaim that's been made is indicated, who the eClaim was submitted by, and the employee number for the submitter. The date and time that the eClaim was submitted, and then the date that the eClaim is processed for when it is. And there is a status that is connected to each eClaim. So for an eClaim, it always starts out as submitted, as I mentioned before. And since it hasn't been processed, there is no date corresponding to an eClaim with a status of submitted. Once there's some kind of update from CrewPay, then you do happen to see a date and then the new status. That's usually approved, partially approved, denied, or returned in some cases. So now let's move on to a little bit more of a complicated calculation, and that would be calculating per diems for multi-day pairings. As we mentioned, we use the departures timings to figure out the first per diem we're eligible for, and the arrivals timings for the last per diem that we are eligible for. So let's start out with December the 9th. We have a departure time of 4:55 p.m. and a check-in time of 3:55 p.m. So if we look over at departures, we know that we did not depart before 8 a.m. So that's automatically a no for breakfast on day 1. We didn't depart before 12:30 on day 1, so it's also a no to lunch. We did, however, depart before 6 p.m. and we were on duty fully from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. So dinner is the first per diem that we are eligible for on day 1. It's then easiest to skip over everything else and go down to the last day of the pairing, which is December the 11th, and then look at the arrival time of the last flight and the checkout time of the last flight. So when we look at the arrivals column, we can see that the last flight arrived at 8:07 p.m. So it clearly arrived after 9:30 a.m., which means we get a breakfast on the last day. It arrived after 1:30 p.m., so we get a lunch on the last day. It arrived after 6:30 p.m., so we get a dinner on the last day. The flight did not arrive after 1 a.m., and we were not on duty from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. So that means that on day 3, the last per diem that we are eligible for is dinner. So then what we do after all this is we really just fill in the gaps. So since we know that we're entitled to dinner on day 1, it follows that we must be entitled to a snack. On day 2, we are away the entire day. So breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snack are also entitled. And then on day 3, we would fill in the breakfast and the lunch. So for this pairing, we are entitled to a dinner and snack per diem on day 1, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snack on day 2, and breakfast, lunch, dinner on day 3. But now we return to the second question of US versus Canadian rate. Now, just to fit in all the information needed to answer this question, I have cut out the day 1 portion of this pairing. But we know, and I'll just put it in so that you can see it, that we were entitled to dinner and also entitled to snack. On day 2, we know that we were entitled to all of them. And on day 3, we were entitled to breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So on day 1, we went from Vancouver to Montreal. That's automatically going to mean that everything is Canadian. So the dinner and snack per diem from day 1, those are paid at the Canadian rate. Now on day 2, we're in Montreal to start the day. We know that we're entitled to a breakfast. And in the Canadian or US rate section, we have the statement that layovers are always paid at layover rate, and that breakfast is always paid at the rate of the country of departure. So breakfast, in this case, is definitely going to be Canadian. And then for lunch, we then look at the decision tree, where we're told that if the flight departs prior to noon, lunch is paid at the rate of country of destination. If it's noon or later, lunch is paid at the rate of country of departure. The flight departed at 6:21 p.m., which is long afternoon, so that means that lunch is also paid at the Canadian rate. When we look at dinner, the decision tree tells us to differentiate between 5:30 p.m., that is before 5:30 p.m., and then 5:30 or later. The flight departed Montreal for San Francisco at 6:21 p.m., so that would be after 5:30, and accordingly the dinner is paid at rate of country of departure. That is Canada as well. For snack per diem, we can see that the flight departed prior to 10:30 p.m., clearly, since it left at 6:21 p.m. So snack would be at the US rate. And you might remember that we talked about, with per diems in general, figuring out the first and the last per diem and then filling in the gaps is generally the easiest thing to do. So for day 2, we figured out that the first per diem, that is a US per diem, is the snack per diem. So then if we go to day 3, the most logical thing to do would be to work backwards from the last per diem. So we know that dinner is the last per diem that we are entitled to in this pairing. We also know that the flight leaving San Francisco for Vancouver left at 5:55 p.m. So if we go back to the dinner decision tree, we see that if the flight departs prior to 5:30 p.m., dinner is paid at the rate of country of destination. If it's 5:30 or later, dinner is paid at the rate of country of departure. So because it was 5:55 p.m., that means that this dinner is paid at the US rate. And since we are in the US in San Francisco before this dinner and after the snack from day 2, we can logically just fill in the gaps. So we know that breakfast on day 3 will be a US breakfast, and then lunch on day 3 will be a US lunch. So all that together, we have dinner and snack at Canadian rate on day 1, breakfast, lunch, and dinner at Canadian rate on day 2, which then becomes a snack at US rate on day 2, and then breakfast, lunch, and dinner at the US rate. We should also add that there is one CICO per diem, that is check-in, check-out, and it is worth $5.05 for each eligible hotel stay that you have in a pairing. So there were 2 hotel stays. One was in Montreal and one was in San Francisco. If we multiply $5.05 by 2, that comes out to $10.10, and we can see that paid here in the check-in, check-out column in crew cycle expenses. So we have been given our check-in, check-out correctly. That is used for tipping when we are on layover, going to and from different hotel properties. As far as the per diems that we mentioned from the previous page, we can see that there was a dinner and a snack paid that are connected to the first day. That's the Vancouver to Montreal day. There is also 4 per diems that were paid for day 2. And then 3 that were paid for day 3. And they are all present. And all of these correspond to the correct Canadian or US rate that we determined earlier. Let's move on to airport standby. For the purpose of determining per diems, you can think of an airport standby as an actual flight. The departures section of the Mystery of Meals can be used in conjunction with your airport standby start time, and the arrival timings can be used with your airport standby end time. In this case, we had an airport standby for 4 hours on reserve, starting at 4:50 p.m. and ending at 8:50 p.m. When looking in the departures column, we can ask, did the flight, or standby in this case, depart or start before 8 a.m.? No, it did not. Did it start or depart before 12:30? No, it did not. Did it start or depart before 6 p.m.? Yes, it did. And then were we on duty for 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m.? Yes, we were. So we figured out the first per diem we're entitled to, and that would be a dinner. We know that we were not entitled to breakfast or lunch. We know that we were entitled to dinner. Now, did we arrive after 1 a.m.? No, we did not. So in this case, dinner is the per diem that we are entitled to for this particular airport standby. Now, what about the situations where we have a standby but are then assigned a flight or multiple flights? You can still think of the airport standby as a flight. So in this case, the airport standby started at 6:55 a.m. and a flight assignment was given involving a deadhead to Edmonton and operating back to Vancouver. So to determine our first eligible per diem, we of course use the departures section of the Mystery of Meals. Did we depart or start our airport standby before 8 a.m.? Yes, we did. And we were on duty well before 8 a.m. to 9:30, so breakfast is the first per diem that we're entitled to. If we go to arrivals, we can still add in that breakfast per diem. And then looking at the last flight, that is AC 241, it arrived at 12:49 p.m. and checkout time was 1:04 p.m. Did we arrive after 1:30 p.m.? No, we did not. so we're not eligible for lunch. Breakfast, therefore, is the only per diem we are entitled to in this particular duty day. Now, what about standby that we do after arrival back at home base? So in this case, I was assigned a 1-hour standby from 12:45 p.m. to 1:45 p.m. in Toronto, and that was following a Boston turn. As with anything else, this airport standby counts as a flight for the purpose of meal allowances. So let's figure out our first meal allowance. Toronto to Boston, that departed at 7:37 a.m. Check-in time was 6:40. To get a breakfast per diem, I had to depart before 8 a.m. Yes, I did, and was on duty from 8 to 9:30, so breakfast is the first per diem I'm entitled to. If we then look at that standby, it ended at 1:45 p.m. We know that I was eligible for breakfast from looking earlier. To get a lunch per diem, I had to arrive after 1:30 and be on duty from 12:30 to 1:30 p.m. Remember that airport standby is a flight for the purpose of meal allowances. So this flight arrived at 1:45 p.m., which is after 1:30, and I was on duty from 12:30 to 1:30 all the way to 1:45. So lunch I am eligible for. Dinner I am not, because I did not arrive after 6:30 p.m., and that of course means I'm not eligible for the snack either. So for this particular pairing, I am entitled to a breakfast and to a lunch per diem. So verifying that these per diems are paid on our flight summary is a fundamental skill. Flight summaries are only accessible via HR Connects. You'll not be able to access these through AC Life. You can see your pay statement on AC Life, but flight summary you must get through HR Connects. How can you ensure that your standby was paid as far as your per diems are concerned? You can look under crew cycle expenses. This standby was on October the 10th. We can see that there is activity for October the 10th in crew cycle expenses, and there was a dinner per diem paid for the standby. So that's perfectly fine. There are no issues there. Now, how can you see if a airport standby per diem was not paid? Typically, an airport standby per diem is just not going to show up at all on your flight summary in certain situations. So if we look here, October the 10th, that is what we want to look for in crew cycle expenses. And in this example, we can see that there's October 2nd, 7th, and 9th, but nothing corresponding to the 10th. So in this case, we would then conclude that our airport standby per diem was not paid. If I want to make an eClaim for an airport standby, this is all fairly straightforward. The only thing of note, pairing and pairing date are not required because airport standbys don't have a pairing number or pairing date associated with them. So you don't have to put this in. If you want to put something in that's valid, you can put in a letter corresponding to a base, V is Vancouver, for example, and you can just put the date of the standby in pairing date if you so wish. You will be asked for a flight number, even though you didn't actually do one. You can just put in 0, and that will work perfectly fine. Flight date can just be the date of the airport standby. Another minor point of frustration is eClaims will not allow you to put in the same departure and arrival airport. So for me as a Vancouver-based crew member, if I do an airport standby, I put in YVR in departure airport, and then I just invent an airport code for the arrival airport. And in my case, I just put 3Zs. Otherwise, it would just be layover expense amount missing and the amount entitled. The amount paid is 0. And then just to make it very clear, it's for an airport standby. In the comments, I put dinner per diem not paid for airport standby. And that way they also have context for why I've invented an airport code that doesn't actually exist. We have what are known as special night dinners that are paid to us, and these are paid for red-eye turns. In our collective agreement, these are referred to as single duty period all-night flight pairings. It is a mouthful. People usually informally refer to these as red-eye turns. To get the special night dinner, you have to do a red-eye turn, and that is defined as a single duty period pairing. That is, there is no layover involved. There is a minimum of 4 hours in the pairing that fall between 10 p.m. and 8 a.m. You have to be on duty for at least 6 hours, and then you have to have 4 or more actual flying hours. All these combined define a single duty period all-night flight pairing. In other words, a red-eye turn. Meal allowances, as we've mentioned before, are calculated using Article 7.02 in the collective agreement. We had something change relatively recently. As of January of 2024, all of our special night dinners are supposedly automatically paid to us now. They never used to be, but as a result of recent grievances, the company has agreed to do a manual pay adjustment corresponding to any special night dinners. These you are not going to see on your flight summary. You will have to look at your pay statement, and there will be a line entry that's titled Crew Cycle EXP-ABJMT. That stands for Crew Cycle Expense Adjustment. And that's where you'll see a total amount for special night dinners. If you don't see a crew cycle expense adjustment and you have a pairing that involves a special night dinner, then you will need to make an eClaim. For this particular example pairing that I have, where I operated flight 2116 from Vancouver to Toronto and came right back from Toronto to Vancouver, this is a classic single duty period all-night flight pairing. And I am eligible in this particular case for a special night dinner. I did not have the special night dinner paid out on my pay statement, and when looking at my crew cycle expenses for this month, there was no special night dinner that was paid out in the N column. That would be where the night dinners are paid, when they are paid. So I had to make an eClaim, and I will show you the way that this eClaim works. It's important for the meal type when claiming for the special night dinner that you put special dinner and not just dinner, as this is a very specific type of dinner that only applies to single duty day all-night flight pairings. As with any per diem eClaim, when you aren't paid it at all, you specify that the layover expense amount was missing, how much you're entitled to, and the amount that was paid. The very specific wording I like to use is Special a night dinner not paid for single duty day all night flight, and the word pairing is just off screen in that text box there, but special night dinner not paid for single duty day all night flight pairing. So where would you find your approved per diem eClaims paid out? You'll find these most often on your next flight summary, and it will show as a pay claim expense adjustment, and this will be in the crew cycle expenses section of your next flight summary once the eClaims have been approved. So you can see in this particular example that I have two, and they were individually for special night dinners for $38.71 each. That was the special night dinner rate in effect at the time. If you aren't paid for an eClaim for a meal allowance within 1 month of approval, you should be following up with fa.crewpay@aircanada.ca using your company email address to reach out and seek clarification. Where would you find your DOT premium paid out? You would look under the ground duty credits section of your flight summary, and you can see it classified as EXT-duty hours, so extended duty hours. Notice that in the description column in the flight information section, there is duty extend on most of these, but just the word DPG on one of the line entries. You are still entitled to DOT on DPG credit, and you can see that you were in fact paid for DPG with that 50% premium as well. All four of them can be found in this example. Where would you find draft premium paid out? Like DOT, it is found under ground duty credits. Draft assign is what you'd see in flight information, and then draft prem for draft premium is what you would see under ground duty credits. You'll notice here as well that DPG is all that shows for this line, but it too is eligible for draft premium, just like all the other entries. Where would you find your RDO premium paid out? As with the other premiums, you would find it under the ground duty credit section of your flight summary. RDO with PRM is RDO with premium, and in the ground duty credit section, you would see aircraft type followed by RDO premium. Where would you find your annual recurrent training paid out? Because it's paid at 50% of your air rate, it is also found under ground duty credits. Now with our annual recurrent training, we also do online training, and this too can be found under ground duty credits. The online training shows up as TRNG-online, that is training online. It's worth noting that if you're on reserve, recurrent training counts towards your MMG, but TRNG online does not count towards your MMG. On a block, any art-related activity is paid over and above your block hours. Other trainings, such as the Service Director Summit workshops that we had in 2023, follow similar rules but are listed slightly different in the description section of the ground duty credits area of the flight summary. Now, in this particular case, I did annual recurrent training as a reserve. So my time in training had to be counted towards my minimum monthly guarantee. If we do a little bit of math here, we can see that, as always, I was supposed to be getting 75 hours or 4,500 minutes of guaranteed pay. But if we do a quick bit of math, we can see when adding 2483 and 1627 that the total comes to 4110. This is, of course, not 4,500. So we have an issue. There is some missing credit. If we take 4,500 and subtract 4110, we have a total of 390 minutes to account for. Thankfully, I can confirm that these minutes were paid, and I will explain to you why. If we look under ground duty credits, as I mentioned earlier on reserve, annual recurrent training counts towards MMG. So all of the minutes spent in ART have to be included for pay purposes within the MMG guarantee. And that way you're not double dipping. So you can't get paid for annual recurrent training and also get those same minutes paid out in your MMG top up. We have 2 activities for ART that do count towards MMG, and both of these count for 390 minutes. 390. Let's try that again. 390. And 390. Now, ground duty is paid at half of our airtime. We then have to convert our time spent in annual recurrent training in minutes to our time that would have otherwise been spent in the air. So we need to multiply both of these 390 minute sessions by 50%. And that will give us the equivalent in minutes in the air. So 195 minutes in the air is what we see in both cases. When we add both of these together, it gets us right back to 390. And that was the exact amount of time that was missing in the 400 or 4,110 minutes. And we add those together. That gets us to 4,500. So I was paid correctly for my annual recurrent training. And that includes getting a top up of 1,627 minutes because I didn't complete all of my flying hours in that month. Where are ground duty and post duty credit paid out? Well, we have a theme here. It's paid under ground duty credits. You will see it encoded as SVCE to PSGR. Ground service to passenger claims and post-duty credit claims are not disambiguated here. So you'll need to cross-reference what is seen in the pay minutes column to any eClaims that you have made and make the deduction on your own. As a general rule of thumb, ground duty eClaims, in order to be valid, have to be for a minimum duration of 30 minutes. So most of the time, any line that corresponds to 30 or more minutes is going to correspond to ground duty, ground service to passengers. You can also assume that in general, any line for less than 30 minutes corresponds to your post-duty credit. That is your time spent past your checkout time waiting for assistance for passengers. This is most often waiting for wheelchairs for passengers requiring that assistance. Where is your pre-duty credit paid out? This is yet again found in ground duty credits. On your flight summary, it is listed as pre-post CR, that is pre-post credit. This will be paid to you when you show up more than an hour early as required for check-in time for a wide-body aircraft. You can look at EPUB for any official pre-duty credit or pairing check-in times. Globe is often incorrect, so you shouldn't rely on it. How are sick days paid on reserve? When you look at your flight summary in the flight information section, you will see activity corresponding to sickness. In this case, the 13th of May to the end of day on the 16th of May. Whether you have sick days left in your sick bank or not, your sickness is paid out separately if you're entitled. And 2 hours and 25 minutes per day spent sick off of payroll is taken out of your minimum monthly guarantee. So in this case, based on the time that I was sick, I was off payroll for a total of 4 days. And that can be seen where out of the 31 days in the month, I was available for 27 of them. On reserve, you're charged for 1 sick day for each partial or complete 24-hour period that you are booked off. This starts at the exact time that you book off and ends at the exact time that you book back on. Since 2 hours and 25 minutes per day is removed from MMG, we have to convert that, first of all, to minutes format, so that becomes 145 minutes. And then what we can do is take 145 minutes and multiply that by the 4 days spent off payroll, and that is a total of 580 minutes. So what we want to do is subtract that number from the 4,500 minutes or 75 hours that we start out at and see what we get. In this case, that number ends up being 3,920 minutes. So our reduced minimum guarantee is correct. But fear not, we are paid for that time taken off payroll if we have sick days. You can see that by looking under flight duty credits. In the AED days column, you can see that 4 days are being paid for with index item number 2. There is a rate generated per day related to my sick time, and 4 times that number equals $706.72. So I have been paid for my sick time since I had sick days. It's just separated from my minimum monthly guarantee. Blockholder reassignment. What should I be paid when I am on reassignment? There's a couple of options. If you are reassigned for more flying hours than what you were originally scheduled to do, then you are paid for the hours that you are reassigned to. Conversely, if you end up getting reassigned for and working fewer hours than your originally scheduled pairings, you're paid for your originally scheduled pairings. Your per diems are never protected. You are only issued per diems based on what you have actually flown. Here we see an example in the flight summary of a reassignment where what I was reassigned to was in fact worth more than what I originally flew. So in this case, all I'm going to see is what I actually flew on reassignment. You can see that with reassign, indicated in the description column. And other than that, there is nothing different as far as looking at the flight summary for information. Where it gets a little bit different is if you end up getting reassigned for and working fewer hours than your originally scheduled pairings. Because in this case, you have to be pay protected for what you originally scheduled to do. And in order to do that, you have to have pay protect for your originally scheduled items, and then you will see reassign for what you were reassigned to. But there is an important differentiator. There is an action code column, and in this action code column you can see DP, and the best way to think of this action code is don't pay. So the DP action code instructs crew pay to see what you were reassigned to, but not to pay you for what you're reassigned to. The reason it's important to have this is at the end of the day, you can see that there's index items 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. But you'll notice that for any of the index items that have DP, you will not see them paid out in flight duty credits. You'll just see that there's 11 and 14. That corresponds to what I was pay protected for, which is 550 and 565 minutes respectively. As mentioned before, per diems are never protected. You are only issued per diems based on what you have actually flown. So this is where it is important for you to see what you actually flew, even though you're not paid for it. The reason for that is what you're pay protected for, we're not going to look at when calculating per diems. We're only going to look at what was actually flown. So in this case, on reassignment, I did Vancouver to Toronto. There was a layover, and then I operated back from Toronto to Vancouver. I had crew rest, and then I did another assignment on reassignment, and that was Vancouver to Winnipeg, and turning right back around from Winnipeg to Vancouver. So instead of a London pairing and layover, I was given 2 other assignments on reassignment. So with Vancouver to Toronto, based on the departure time of that first flight, I was entitled to lunch. And coming back to base in Vancouver at 10:03 a.m., that meant that breakfast was the last per diem I was entitled to, and I can just fill in the gaps with dinner and with snack I had a layover in Toronto, so I get a check-in, check-out per diem. That's there. And then for a Winnipeg turn based on the timing, 1:30 is too late for a lunch per diem, but does allow me to have a dinner per diem based on the time I come back to Vancouver, so that is also correct in that case. If you have questions about your specific pay or flight summary, fa.crewpay@aircanada.ca is your official company-side resource for any of your pay inquiries. That should be your first point of contact. If you are unable to come to a resolution with CrewPay with respect to any pay-related entitlement, you can then reach out to your local union officers for assistance, and then make sure that you carbon copy pay@acomponent.ca as well, as you are looking to recover any missed monies. Once again, on behalf of the Education Committee at the Vancouver Local, thank you for being here today, and we'll see you next time.